Clara Marsh had read it so many times that the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink beginning to ghost at the crease where her thumb pressed each night before she slept. She had memorized it the way you memorize a hymn in childhood, not by effort but by repetition, until the words were simply inside you, settled there like stones at the bottom of a well. 3 promises. Land, a house, a good name. She did not know, stepping onto the wagon in Independence, Missouri on the 14th of April, 1861, the very week the guns opened at Fort Sumter and a country began tearing itself in two, that only 2 of those promises would prove to be true. She would not know which one was false for another 2,100 miles, and when she found out, she would do something that nobody in the wagon train, nobody in the Willamette Valley, and nobody who wrote to her from Ohio would ever have predicted. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We must begin where Clara began, with the letter, and what she wanted, and what she was leaving behind. Clara was 29 years old in the spring of 1861, which meant she was old enough to know exactly what she was doing and young enough to still believe it might work. She had been born and raised in Coshocton County, Ohio, the second of 4 daughters of a man who loved his children adequately and his farm completely. When he died the previous November, the farm went to Clara's brother William, as was expected, as had always been expected, as had never once been questioned by anyone including Clara herself, even though she had worked that land as faithfully as any of them. Her older sister Josephine was married and settled in Cincinnati. Her younger sisters, both of them, were spoken for. Clara was not. Clara had been, once, a man named Edward Finch who died of typhoid in the summer of '58 before they ever made it to the church, but that was 3 years ago now, and the county had a long memory and a short imagination, and what they imagined about Clara Marsh and her prospects had recently turned from hopeful to simply kind. The kind that means the same thing as giving up on someone. Her deepest fear, the one she had never written in any letter and barely admitted to herself in the small hours of sleepless nights, was this: that she would arrive in Oregon and find she was still nothing there, that she had carried herself 2,000 miles only to be the same woman in different weather, that the problem was not Ohio, that the problem was her. She had answered Elias Croft's advertisement in the Western Emigrant in February. He had written back within the month. His handwriting was careful and even, which she took as a good sign. The letter described 320 acres in the Willamette Valley, 12 miles south of Oregon City. A house he had built himself, 2 rooms with a stone hearth and a wood floor. And a reputation, he wrote. His exact words, and she had read them enough times she could hear his voice in them now, though she had never heard his voice. A reputation in the community that I am not ashamed to stand behind. Land, a house, a good name. She agreed to come. The wagon train that departed Independence on the 14th of April had 22 wagons and 47 people, not counting the children under 10, of whom there were 11. The captain was a man named Gerald Plunkett, who had made the crossing twice before, and spoke of the trail the way some men speak of a difficult but necessary relative, with resignation and a certain grudging respect. He told them what to carry and what to leave behind. He told them that the Platte would be running high this year. He told them that alkali water would kill a mule faster than a bullet. He told them to boil what they could and trust what they couldn't. Clara drove her own wagon. She had hired a boy of 15 named Sam Whitfield to handle the oxen at the river crossings and the mountain grades, but for the flat stretches and the long afternoons on the Platte River Road, she held the lines herself. Her hands blistered inside the first week and hardened inside the second, and after that they simply became hands that drove a wagon. By the time they reached the Platte River Valley, 2 weeks out of Independence, Clara had stopped thinking of herself as a woman who was going somewhere and had started thinking of herself as a woman who was moving. The distinction mattered. Going somewhere implied a destination, a future, a person waiting. Moving was simpler than that. You woke in the cold before sunrise, you broke camp, you put your face into the wind, and you moved. The Platte was low and broad and deceptive. It looked, as Captain Plunkett said, like a mile wide and an inch deep. But there were soft spots that could swallow a wheel to the hub, and the current ran cold and fast in the center channel even when the edges were still. They crossed on the 28th of April, on a Tuesday, in water that ran to Clara's knees when she stepped down to help lever one of the Bender family's wagons off a submerged rock. The cold went through her like a blade. She did not mention it to anyone. There was a woman in the train named Harriet Webb who had crossed once before, in '54, with her first husband. He had died at South Pass of what the company doctor called inflammation of the lungs, and what Harriet called simply the mountain cold. She had gone back to Missouri, married again, a quieter man this time, she told Clara, a more careful man, and was making the crossing again. She walked alongside Clara's wagon most afternoons and talked, not incessantly, but steadily, the way a creek talks. Just enough to let you know it was there. "You nervous about him?" Harriet asked one evening, when the wagons had circled outside of Fort Kearny and the fires were going, and the smell of wood smoke and salt pork hung in the still air. "Some," Clara said. It was more honest than she usually allowed herself to be. "That's right," Harriet said. "That's the correct amount of nervous. Enough to pay attention, not enough to stop your feet." Clara wrote that down in her diary that night. She wrote down a great many things. The color of the grass on the prairie, which was not green the way Ohio grass was green but something older and more complicated. A yellow-green with silver in it when the wind moved through. The sound a wagon wheel made on dry hardpan versus mud. A higher pitch on the hard ground, a sucking reluctance on the soft. The weight of the night sky over the Platte Valley, which had more stars in it than she had known existed, spread so thick in places they looked like spilled flour on a dark cloth. She wrote about the letter too, about land and a house and a good name. She wrote, "I have read it again, and I still believe it. I am choosing to believe it. There is a difference." They passed Chimney Rock on the 18th of May, that strange column of pale stone rising from the flat Nebraska plain like a finger pointing at the sky, visible for 2 full days before they reached it, and another full day after. Clara found herself watching it over her shoulder long after they had passed, unsure what she felt. Not homesickness. Something more like the opposite. A feeling of irrevocable distance from everything she had been. A child in the Bender wagon died on the 22nd of May. Her name was Lucy. She was 4 years old and had crossed the prairie in good spirits and died of cholera in 48 hours, with a speed that left her parents bewildered more than bereft. At first, they simply could not absorb it fast enough. They buried her in the earth beside the trail and marked the grave with a cedar cross and a piece of broken wagon spoke, because that was what they had. Captain Plunkett said the words, and Harriet Webb sang a hymn, and Clara stood at the back of the gathering and looked at the low mound of turned earth and thought, "This is what the trail asks for. Not just your comfort, not just your ease, it will take what it wants." She did not write in her diary that night. At Fort Laramie, which they reached on the 3rd of June, 640 miles from Independence, Clara mailed a letter to her sister Josephine in Cincinnati. She wrote about the crossing of the Platte, about Harriet Webb, about Chimney Rock. She did not mention Lucy Bender's grave. She said, "I am in good health and good spirits, and I believe I have made the right decision." She said, "I think the land will be good." She did not say, "There is a thing I am afraid of, and I cannot name it yet." South Pass came on the 21st of June. 7,412 feet above sea level, though you would not know it to look at it. The pass was broad and gentle, not the sharp mountain crossing Clara had imagined, but a long rolling grade that leveled finally into a wide saddle between the Wind River Range and the Pacific Springs drainage. Captain Plunkett stopped the wagons at the crest and said, quietly, almost to himself, "This is the Continental Divide. Everything west of here runs to the Pacific." Clara stood at the high point of the crossing and looked west. The land fell away before her in long brown folds, the sky enormous and pale at the horizon, and she understood for the first time that she was not going to Ohio in any form anymore. She was going somewhere entirely new. She was going to find out whether she was someone different there. It was also at South Pass that she noticed something she had been trying not to notice for several weeks. One of the men in the wagon train, a man named Jonas Harte, traveling alone to take up a claim near Fort Boise, had been watching her, not unkindly, not improperly, but steadily, the way a man watches something he is trying to understand. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the hands of someone who had done serious work and the quiet of someone who had done serious thinking. He had helped her twice on the trail, once at the Platte crossing when her rear wheel had caught on a submerged rock, once when one of her oxen threw a shoe 3 miles from camp, and each time he had done it without making it a favor that needed acknowledging. She wrote in her diary on the night they camped at Pacific Springs, "Jonas Harte helped me reset the oxbow yoke this afternoon without being asked. He did not stay to talk. I do not know what to do with a man who asks for nothing." She crossed it out before she closed the diary. But the impression of the pen was still there in the page beneath. The Snake River. The Blue Mountains. The long descent into the Columbia Plateau. By the time they reached Fort Boise on the 15th of August, Clara's face had been darkened by 4 months of trail sun and her hands bore 3 permanent calluses, and she had stopped being afraid of river crossings in the way she had been afraid at the beginning, not because the crossings were less dangerous, but because she had learned to read the water. She could see now where the current ran strong beneath a still surface. She had learned to trust that knowledge the way she was learning, slowly, to trust herself. Jonas Harte left the wagon train at Fort Boise. He was taking his claim north of the fort, outside the Willamette Valley land rush. He came to say goodbye the evening before he turned off the trail. He stood at the back of Clara's wagon with his hat in his hands and said he wished her well in Oregon City. He said the man she was going to was a fortunate man. She said, "You don't know him." He said, "I know you." Then he put his hat back on and walked away, and Clara stood watching him until the dark took him. And then she went inside the wagon and sat in the space she had made for herself among the trunks and quilts and bags of cornmeal. And she did not write in her diary that night either. The Blue Mountains were the last true obstacle before the Willamette Valley, and they were not kind. The grade up the eastern face was steep enough that the wagons had to be unloaded and the contents carried by hand while the oxen made the pull in teams, combined. Clara carried her own trunk up the mountain in 2 trips, sweating through her dress in the August heat even at elevation, the rock sharp under her shoes and the drop on the western side farther than she liked to look at. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the next step. They came down into the Grande Ronde Valley on the 19th of August, and the grass there was the greenest Clara had seen since Missouri, and some of the women wept at the sight of it. Clara did not weep, but she put her hand flat against a stand of Oregon white oak and held it there for a long moment, feeling the rough bark against her palm. She thought, "I am here. I am still here." The Dalles. Then the Columbia. Then, by the first week of September, the wide plain of the Willamette Valley opening before them like something that had been promised a very long time ago. Clara arrived in Oregon City on the 4th of September, 1861, 143 days after she had departed Independence, Missouri. She was 29 years old. She was road-burned and thinner than she had been, and she had driven a wagon 2,170 miles with her own hands, and she was still afraid of the thing she could not name. Elias Croft was waiting at the edge of town. He was taller than she had imagined, though she had not quite admitted to herself that she had imagined him, with brown hair that had gone to gray at the temples and eyes the color of the Platte in the middle distance, which is to say a gray-green that was hard to hold. He held his hat in both hands. He said her name carefully, Clara, as though making sure he had it right. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a long time for and is not yet certain he deserves. She had expected awkwardness. There was some. She had expected stiffness. There was that too, but underneath both she found something she had not expected. A man who was genuinely, quietly glad she had come. Not relieved in the way of a man who had worried she might not arrive. Glad in the way of a man who had not let himself hope and was now surprised by his own relief. He drove her out to the claim that afternoon. 320 acres in the Willamette Valley, 12 miles south of Oregon City, the Calapooia foothills rising to the west, the valley floor flat and dark, and river watered to the east. The land was real. She stepped down from his wagon and put her feet on it, and it held her without apology. The house was real too. 2 rooms as he had written, stone hearth and a wood floor. The floor was rough and the mortar between the hearthstones wanted filling, but the walls were true and the roof kept the weather out, and there was a window facing east that caught the morning light and held it like a cupped hand. She stood in the empty room and thought, 2 of the 3 things are true. The land, the house. She had not yet tested the third. The following Tuesday, Clara drove herself into Oregon City for provisions. She was not yet comfortable with the town. It was larger than she had expected, a proper place with a mill and a courthouse and a newspaper and strong opinions, but she needed flour and salt pork and thread, and Elias had offered to drive her, but she had said she would manage, because she always managed, and she needed to know she still could. At Morrison's General Store, she waited behind a woman named Delia Forsyth while the clerk tallied her order. Delia Forsyth was the kind of woman who knows everything about everyone, and wears that knowledge openly, not with malice exactly, but with the easy certainty of someone who has never questioned her right to know. She was talking to the clerk about a family named Ackerman who had just arrived from Sacramento, and then she turned to look at Clara with the directness of someone who already knew who she was. "You're the woman Elias Croft sent for," Delia said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara said. Delia looked at her for a moment with an expression that Clara would think about later and try to name. It was not pity. It was something closer to calculation. The look of someone deciding how much to say and landing on not quite enough. "He's a hard worker," Delia said finally. "I'll give him that." She paid for her goods and left. Clara stood at the counter and placed her order and did not ask the question that was sitting at the base of her throat. She paid and drove home and unloaded the provisions and started the fire and began the evening meal, and it was only when the light was nearly gone and Elias came in from the east field and washed his hands at the basin that she looked at him across the table and said, quietly and without accusation, "What is it that Delia Forsyth knows about you that she decided not to tell me?" He did not answer immediately. That, more than anything, told her what she needed to know about the character of the answer. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment the way a man looks at something he has been carrying for a long time and is tired of the weight. His name, he said, was not good in Columbus, Ohio. He had come west in '57 to escape what he called, with care, a business arrangement that had gone badly. There were 3 men in Columbus to whom he owed money. Real money, not a small debt, but the kind of debt that has names and lawyers and consequences attached to it. He had borrowed to expand a dry goods store. A bad winter followed by a spring flood followed by a warehouse fire. He could not pay. He could not stay and face not paying. He came west instead. He had built the land and the house honestly. He had worked and worked hard, and the claim was his by right and by labor. His name in Oregon City was clean, but it was clean the way new paint is clean, covering something that remained underneath it. "You wrote that you had a good name," Clara said. "I have a good name here," he said. "I didn't say where." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire had burned down to orange coals. The room was warm and close, and the east window had gone dark. "That is not the same thing," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." He waited. He did not try to explain further, or argue, or reach across the table and soften it with touch. He simply waited, the way a man waits who has finally said a true thing and is willing to let it cost him whatever it costs. She did not tell him that night what she had decided. She went to bed in the small room she had made her own. Curtain hung across the doorway, trunk beneath the east window, her few things arranged in the order she preferred, and she lay in the dark and thought. She thought about Edward Finch, who had been honest and had died young before any of his promises could be tested. She thought about her father, who had been honest and had given his farm to William without a second thought, because that was simply how things were done. She thought about Jonas Harte, who had helped her twice and asked for nothing and said he knew her, and whether that was something or simply the thing men say when they are leaving. She thought about Delia Forsyth's face, that calculating pause, the words chosen and the words withheld. She thought about the land. She thought about the morning light in the east window. She thought about the floor Elias had laid board by board, for a woman he had never met and had no certainty would come. She thought about the debt in Columbus. 3 men with lawyers and consequences. Real money, real failure. A man who had run from it, yes, but a man who had built something real from the running. And a man who, when she asked him directly across a table in the last light of evening, had told her the truth. She thought about her deepest fear, the thing she had never written down, that she would arrive somewhere new and find she was still nothing there. She lay in the dark, and she thought about that fear, and she held it up to what she actually knew. And what she actually knew was this. She had driven a wagon 2,170 miles. She had crossed the Platte in high water. She had carried her own trunk up the Blue Mountains on her own legs. She had buried a child she hardly knew and kept moving. She had sat in the dark of a wagon at Fort Boise and watched a man walk away into the night, and she had not called him back because she knew where she was going, and she had decided to go there. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She had simply been in a place that did not have room for what she was. In the morning, before Elias was up, she went to the small desk he had made from a packing crate and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to her sister Josephine in Cincinnati. She wrote, "I have arrived safely and I believe I have chosen well, though not for the reasons I expected." The second was to the Coshocton County Land Office, inquiring about property transfer records. She wanted to understand, precisely and legally, what her rights were on this claim. The third letter, the one she sat over longest, the one she rewrote twice, was addressed to a law office in Columbus, Ohio. She did not know the names of Elias's creditors, but she knew the city, and she knew the year the debt was made, and she knew that things left unresolved have a way of arriving eventually, whether you send for them or not. Better to send for them yourself, on your own terms, before they came for you. She sealed the third letter. She held it in her hands for a moment. She was not doing this for Elias Croft, she told herself. She was doing it for the land, for the east window, for the floor he had laid board by board. She was doing it because she had come 2,170 miles to stop being nothing, and she was not going to let an unpaid debt in Ohio be the thing that finally undid her. She went outside. The morning was cold and clear, the way September mornings in the Willamette Valley are cold and clear. A cold with intention in it. A cold that knows winter is not far off and wants you to know it too. The valley lay before her in the early light, the grass still holding the last of summer's gold at the tips. The hills to the west were dark with Douglas fir. Elias came out of the house behind her. He stood a few feet away and did not speak, the way a man stands who is not sure whether he is welcome in the space he is standing in. After a while, Clara said, "The land is real." "Yes," he said, "the house is real." "Yes? Then we have 2 out of 3, she said. "I've started on the 3rd. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, "You wrote to Columbus." "I will write to Columbus," she said. "You should have done it yourself years ago. Since you didn't, I am doing it now. It is my name, too." She felt, as she said it, the particular satisfaction of a thing named correctly. My name, too. She was not asking his permission. She was stating a fact about who she had decided to be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told you before you came." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "Are you staying?" he asked. And in his voice there was nothing performative, no attempt to manage the asking, just the plain question of a man who did not know the answer and understood that he had no right to expect one. Clara looked out at the valley. The light was coming up strong now over the eastern hills, the kind of light that shows you everything at once, the good and the rough and the work ahead and the beauty underneath it all. The 2 rocking chairs on the porch behind them caught it and threw long shadows across the boards of the floor Elias had laid. "I didn't walk 2,000 miles to leave," she said. She went back inside and put the kettle on. He followed her in and picked up his hat from the hook by the door and went out to the east field. And neither of them said anything more about it that morning. And that was all right. There would be time for saying things. There was a great deal of time. In her diary that evening, Clara Marsh Croft, she had written both names now, deliberately, the 2 of them together for the first time, wrote the following. The letter had 3 promises. 2 were kept honestly. 1 was kept in the way people keep things they are ashamed of, in a drawer, under other things, hoping not to be found. I found it. I have decided what to do with it. Not for his sake, for mine, for ours, for the name that is mine now too. I walked 2,000 miles to find out if I was someone different on the other side. I have found that I am not different. I am exactly who I was in Ohio. I am simply in a place now where that is enough. The east window catches the morning light and holds it the way a good hand holds a small thing, carefully, without squeezing. I have sat with my coffee in that light 3 mornings now. I intend to sit there for a very long time. She closed the diary. She set it on the crate beside her bed. Outside, in the dark, the Willamette Valley made no sound at all. Not silence. Something older and wider than silence. Just space. Just land. Just the particular quiet of a place that has been waiting a very long time for someone to decide to stay. She had decided,